Parables to understand ourselves. That is the topic of our lecture today. Welcome to this lecture series on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible, developed by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books on biblical stories, on fairy tales, on The Little Prince, on Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and on many other pieces of world literature, including fairy tales. Drewermann's insights from psychology, philosophy, poetry, and the sciences help us read these stories as stories of our own lives. And that is how we will look at the parable of the sower today. But before I go into this particular parable, I would like to talk a little bit about how we interpret parables, how we are to understand the nature of parables. Parables are symbolic stories. And so what we want to do today is to see how we can look at parables in a way that they help us understand our own lives in relation to the bigger questions of life. There are a few points I have before I go into the actual interpretation of the parable of the sower. 5 points I have as a way of introduction. First is the question, what reality do parables talk about? They are symbolic speech. If we do not understand the psychology of parables, we then can completely miss their point and read them as simple allegories about parts of life rather than about a basic attitude toward life. That is something that was discovered actually in the history of research on parables. In the late 19th century, a scholar called Adolf Jülicher talked about how the history of the interpretation of parables had often been that one would take certain parts of a parable and think that each of these parts is about a particular part in life. This is actually illustrated in the parable of the sower, where such an allegory actually was explicitly added to what Jesus had talked about in the parable. It was put in Jesus's mouth by the forming early church, and we'll hear about that. But this is not really the purpose of parables. Allegories are not really the purpose of parables. So parables have a different meaning. They're actually about our existence as a whole. That is why we need to reflect on the different realities involved in parables in terms of an existential and psychological reality. We hear parables as human beings. We hear them as talking about our human existence in relation to the big questions of life, of meaning, worth, and mattering. So we, in a sense, are the topic of the parable, our own human existence. We therefore need to reflect on what our reality as human beings is. What consists of our reality? Is it our external reality? Is it an internal reality? Is it our mind? The meaning worth and mattering of us as humans does not lie in outside things. That is one of the basic presuppositions of all religious and spiritual stories. It's really of all poetry as well. The outside world becomes an image for the internal world. So it is something we experience as feeling, thinking, and longing beings. That is our worth, our reality, our thinking, feeling, and longing aspects as human beings. Now, Eugen Drewermann, and again, you have the name in the description of the video, but his name is spelled like Eugene without an E at the end, and then Drewermann is Drew, D-R-E-W, and then E-R-M-A-N-N. Drewermann argues that we need to look at the psychological reality of our human existence to understand not only the meaning of parables, but really the meaning of any story. But religious, spiritual stories always deal with the meaning of stories in terms of ultimate questions. They look at our life as a whole, and they're reflecting on what the meaning of that life is, not just the temporal meaning of what functions do we have in society or for somebody else, or in terms of survival of our existence, but in terms of mattering, in terms of the longings we have, the desires we have for fulfillment, and so on. And it does not do that just in terms of our life here as we see it, but in terms of ultimate questions, in terms of, do we matter, period? And that relates to all religious stories. Now, parables are stories that want to break through our view of the world as simply temporal. And they want to open life to a perspective of the infinite value of our and each being's existence. So this breaking through the temporal to an eternal or infinite perspective is an essential feature of parables. As such, parables have a particular kind of psychology, a particular way in which we relate, and here comes the psychological dimension, in which we relate in our consciousness to our unconscious. Just as all different forms of religious or spiritual stories relate our conscious thinking to our unconscious experience, things that we're not aware of. And I will now go to a definition that Drewermann provides. Drewermann has talked about the psychology of parables in this volume. This is Depth Psychology and Exegesis, Volume 2. And what you see here is miracle, vision, prophecies, apocalypse, history, and parable. And so in the last section, he really talks about what the function of parables is. And so he says in this volume on page 735, quote, in terms of a depth psychological origin of the different forms of narrative in religious stories, unquote, parables begin with consciousness, with our conscious awareness, with our conscious sense of self, or we might say psychologically, in psychological jargon, with our ego, So this is where parables begin, while myth, other forms of religious stories, myth, like dreams, and they were something that Drewermann talked about in the first volume of Depth Psychology and Exegesis, which is this volume. Let me get this into the camera here, which dealt with dream, myth, fairy tale, saga, and legend. And both of these volumes, the first one was published in 1986, first in Germany, and the second in 1987. Actually, no, I'm sorry, 1984, the first one, and the second in 1985. So myth, like dreams, begin with the unconscious, with what we're typically not aware of, with the evolutionarily shaped imaging layers of our psyche. So you can imagine, so for instance, if you watch a movie, a popular movie, if you watch, let's say, Lord of the Rings, or if you watch Encanto, or if you watch Harry Potter, or if you watch Turning Red right now, which was just released. If you watch any of these movies, they are symbolic movies that, when they touch us, help us connect our conscious thinking, how we think about ourselves, with the imaging layers of our psyche, with the poetic sources, really, that give rise to images. If you are imagining a sky, or if you're imagining looking out on the ocean, you are in touch with your images. And these images have an evolutionary history. Carl Gustav Jung called them archetypes, because humanity has had similar experiences in relation to nature throughout its own evolution. And so our unconscious was shaped by this. Our deepest affects are connected to the images that are in our psyche. And so religious stories traverse this unconscious conscious layer and connect it to each person's individual experience of themselves. And that individual experience of ourselves is what we call our ego, our self. It's our historical personhood. It's who we are as persons. But the fabric of who we are as persons is drawing on the images we use to interpret the meaning of our existence. And so Drewermann writes, thus, this is on page 735 and 736 in this book. And as I have said in previous lectures, I'm hoping to translate these two volumes so that they become available, and so that we can use an understanding of the psychological meaning of these different types of stories to really understand what these stories could mean for us. So Drewermann writes in the second volume on page 735 and 736, we thus, this is the beginning of the quote, we thus encounter the relation of inverted symmetry between dream and parable. You could also say between myth and parable, because dream is very close to myth, which can be formulated as follows. The dream is to be understood as interpretation of reality on the part of the unconscious for the conscious. The parable, on the other hand, is to be understood as an interpretation of the reality on the part of the conscious for the unconscious. So what that means, Myth basically start with imagery from the unconscious and then use that imagery to interpret the conscious. And so they look at the outside world, they look at the body, they look at reality, even historical reality, and they interpret it with these unconscious images and give that meaning. Whereas parables start with the question of historical meaning, start with the questions of thinking, and then bring meanings to the unconscious. So Drewermann continues, from this arises the different function and message of dream and parable. The dream tries in a very simplified way to communicate unconscious impulses to consciousness through the language of symbols and to persuade consciousness to cooperate in the realization of the corresponding affective desires. So our longings that spring up from our unconscious, our longings for love, for protection, for security, for love, they want to be satisfied. And so our unconscious brings them to our consciousness, and dreams try to enlist our consciousness to realize them. Now, Drewermann continues, the parable, on the other hand, tries to bring certain meanings and spiritual objectives to the unconscious through the language of affective images and to persuade the unconscious to cooperate in the realization of the corresponding goals of life. So this is now the conscious goals that we have are something where we fashion meaning, where we have certain ideals, for instance, that we want to realize, and the parable tries to bring these meanings that we want to realize and enlist the unconscious through the language of affective images and persuade it to cooperate in the realization of the corresponding goals. So it's the other way around. So that is the first question, the reality that parables talk about. The second point I want to talk about, who are the listeners of parables? This again is something that has been talked about in the interpretation of parables by scholars, by historical critical scholars, by then scholars who are theologians and try to make sense of it. So who are the listeners of parables? Often this is being asked in historical terms, like who was Jesus talking to, which audience? When the parables are seen as religious, spiritual stories, then Drewermann says, quote, we are the primary listeners, unquote. Because only when we feel ourselves into the situations the characters in the story find themselves in, then we will be able to understand the stories. On page 728 in the second volume of Depth Psychology and Exegesis, Drewermann compares this with the situation of a counselor, that the person telling a parable is in a similar situation as a counselor. Here's the quote I want to share with you. Quote, as a counselor, one attempts to put oneself as much as possible into the shoes of the other person. And then all of a sudden, images emerge in the counselor themselves, through which they then try to describe the client's world of experience. Not infrequently, it can happen that the other then reports that they not long ago had dreams that were similar. I want to share a story here. I once worked with a woman who had a recurring dream in which she would go on a bridge over a lake, and every time she would go there, the bridge would break off. And so when we talked about this, she was able in her own work to realize that this kind of recapitulated an experience she had in herself growing up, that every time she was trying to look for a way out, it would suddenly come to an end. And this client of mine then usually came to the point that she didn't want to exist anymore. This was a very existential threat to her. She thought, I need to disappear. And our entire work for several years really focused on how she can imagine to get across this lake to the other side. And eventually, she actually had a dream in which she was able to get to the other side of that lake, and where the bridge continued. In a way, I, as the counselor, had to imagine that there was another way than for this bridge to suddenly break off. And our work ourselves, and we'll get to this in a moment here in the interpretation, in our work ourselves, I, on some level, had to believe that there was another side to the bridge. For many years, in a way, I had to be the stopgap of the belief that she did not have. She could not believe that there was something else. I had to hold the belief. In that sense, I became part of this dream or the parable. And so this story, in a way, could become a parable for her life. That she had the idea, she had a desire to continue in life. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to be reduced to who she had been told she is, namely nothing. And so I, on some level, had to hold that belief for a long time until she was able to believe it for herself. Now, I want to continue here on page 729. Drewermann says, a parable thus becomes a very emotionally involving recreation of the inner world of the other. And its first effect must, if things go right, consist in the listener feeling completely understood, probably better even as they in their difficulty are able to understand themselves in the moment. Usually such a feeling, such a climate of well-intentioned being understood through the form of a parable to a reduction of anxiety, to a dissolution of inner emotional shutting down and defensive attitude. Whoops, I think I somehow got a sentence mixed up here. The gist is a parable, on some level, is an alternative to a reduction of or leads to a reduction of anxiety, to a dissolution of an inner emotional shutting down and a defensive attitude, as well as a relief of the current or chronically experienced sense of threat. A third point I want to make is parables are not didactic lessons. Throughout the ages, parables were seen as lessons, as effective tools to teach certain ideas. Drewermann writes, after the very justified, this is on page 720 of the second volume, after the very justified, even welcome historical criticism of interpreting parables as allegories, it is once and for all not possible to bring Jesus' parables into the present by arbitrarily making symbolic meanings out of them. In the search for the contemporary meaning of the parables, it is therefore all the more possible and necessary to see the questions, crises, and hardships to which the parables of Jesus try to give an answer, not purely historically, as merely situational, momentary, biographically unique problems. Rather, it is important to understand them as challenges that confront essentially every human being who wants to enter with her or his life into relationship with God. So they're always, in a sense, typical stories that talk about challenges that everyone, in some sense, experiences. I continue. The original situation in the life of Jesus must be understood hermeneutically. Hermeneutically means in terms of interpretation, primarily not in historical terms, but as the model or archetype of the existential situation in the life of every human being. So the speculation of, oh, where in the life of Jesus did this happen, and only there it had a meaning, needs to be opened up to whatever the situation was in the life of Jesus has a typical character in the life of every human being. So to continue with Drewermann's description here, the original situation in the life, I already said that. In other words, in order to understand the lasting relevance of a parable, the original situation, if it is necessary in a given case for the understanding of a parable to know into which situation was spoken, must itself be understood as a parable for a fundamental situation of human existence. And it is precisely here that psychological hermeneutics, that a psychological way of interpreting, provides invaluable services. Because the parable-like universal relevance of the original historical model can certainly not be found in the coincidences or like the arbitrary nature, the accidental nature of the socio-historical or religious historical connections, whether Jesus spoke to his disciples, the Pharisees, tax collectors, Herodians, or to the people of the countryside, is in itself irrelevant to today's readers. The connecting and obliging element between then and now must, as in the case of the logia, of the so-called words of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, be seen not in the circumstances, but in the states, in the feelings and attitudes that then as now can hinder or help people on their way to God. And those states Drewermann enumerates here are discouragement, doubt, disappointment, impatience, narrow-mindedness, anxiety, indignation, mistrust, ambition, greed, feelings of inferiority, competitive envy, obsessions with impoverishment, striving for security, comfort. In short, all conceivable attitudes and emotional conflicts can, as feelings, constitute the catalyst and the material of the parables. For the interpreter, everything depends on correctly perceiving the emotional nuances of the problem posed by a parable. Using the parable of the sower, Drewermann continues, as an example, we will try to show in a moment how, for example, certain feelings of anxiety and disappointment are addressed, not only in a particular moment of Jesus' proclamation, but in the life of every human being in the story of the manifold sowing. So Drewermann interprets that story actually in this volume, and then he interprets it in the commentary on the Gospel of Mark in similar ways. The fourth point I want to make before I go into his interpretation of that story is only if we see our own existence as a parable can we understand and interpret parables. I say that again, only if we see our own existence as a parable, can we understand and interpret parables. Here, I want to go to page 722 of Drewermann's Depth Psychology and Exegesis, volume 2, because here Drewermann tries to go to what the term might have been in Hebrew for parable. It's hard to say actually, because of course we have the Gospels in Greek today, but Jesus spoke Aramaic, and Hebrew would be closer to Aramaic. So here's what Drewermann writes about this on page 722 and 723. It is essential to understand that all speaking of God is possible only in, and Drewermann here uses a Hebrew term, meshalim, in image and riddle speeches. That would be the translation for meshalim. He continues, before one interprets a parable, the question arises for the interpreter to what extent she or he is able and willing to perceive her or his own existence and the world as a parable of God. Because only someone who has learned to see in parables will be qualified to interpret parables. This seeing in parables, however, is neither a purely aesthetic process nor the result of poetic sensibility. Rather, the poetic aspect of a parable arises, as in all true artistic contemplation, as a result of an existential density of existence, in which the external world is felt in its superficiality and discovered in its transparency toward a deeper reality. Just as we could experience earlier in Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman, that any objects in the world, such as wells and water, for example, could be transformed into symbols of a real divine life, so every religious perception essentially transforms the world into image and parable. Indeed, it is the very essence of the religious experience of the world to be able to perceive the entire earthly existence as an image and foreshadowing of eternity. The basic feeling of an absolute fragility and superficiality of the world, the feeling that it is only worthwhile to speak of the world if it brings God to speech, forms the actual reason for a parable. Far from presenting a mere didactic procedure on the lower levels of human comprehension, a parable thus proves to be the fundamental form of communication of the religious dimension in general. It is itself an expression of that process from which all religion arises, and in which all religious experience exists. Whoever wants to know what religion is can only learn it through image and parable. The parable is therefore primarily not a literary form, but the articulation of a mode of existence. This brings me to the last and fifth point. Using psychology as a tool does not psychologize God away. And I'm stressing this because Drewermann is stressing it, but also because this is the point where Drewermann was most misunderstood by his own archbishop, Johannes Joachim Degenhardt in Paderborn, and his close friend, meaning Degenhardt's close friend, Joseph Ratzinger, who is no less than the person who then became Pope Benedict XVI, and who was behind the silencing of Drewermann because Ratzinger, aka Pope Benedict XVI, emeritus now, completely misunderstood Drewermann's point here. He thought that Drewermann was trying to reduce religious texts to psychology. Nothing could be further from the truth. All he wanted to do is use psychology to help us first get in touch with the experiential dimension again of religious texts that completely changes from the affective layer up the whole human experience. So here's what Drewermann says to that charge he would psychologize away religion or the religious dimension. This is found on pages 739 to 730 in the second volume of Depth Psychology and Exegesis. Quote, but parables, one will certainly object immediately, are more than applied psychology and more than the image-based verbalization of emotional states. Here, Drewermann has people like Benedict XVI in his mind and somebody who already was writing reviews of his works that went in this direction. I have described this in detail in my biography of Drewermann, which I don't know whether I have showed to you before, but my biography of Drewermann, let's see if I can find it. I don't have it here on my desk. Oh, actually I do. It is this book, Eugen Drewermann, the biography, which hopefully will be translated into English at some point as well. But this is the kind of counterpart that Drewermann has in mind. So parables, one will certainly object immediately, are more than applied psychology and more than the image-based verbalization of emotional states. That is true, Drewermann says here. The decisive point of a parable does not consist in the image-based verbalization of feelings, but in breaking through the temporal world. To put it psychologically, in the redirection of all drives, in the sublimation of affects, and precisely this central point of the parable must now also form depth psychologically, the core of an appropriate hermeneutics. But if we said earlier, this was in point 4 that I mentioned, that the parable is first of all a form of existence, and not simply a form of speech or of literature, we must now add, in the parable, the narrator herself becomes a thoroughly priestly human being. For it is not only a matter of her, as the parable poet, to notice in her existence the reflection of God above the face of the world, above the mirror of the soul. It is above all a matter of her communicating through her own person as the parable narrator to another human being in such a way that she becomes for the other a tut ankh amun, as the Egyptians said, a, quote, living image of God, unquote. When we see in the prophets how they not only speak in parables or appear before the people with symbolic acts, but like Hosea, like Jeremiah, like Ezekiel, like the prophet Jonah, according to the legend, become in their whole existence a parable before the eyes of all, then we may say that in every single parable speech, in every single parable, the narrator also becomes for the listener a place where heaven opens and the world reveals itself as a prelude, as an exercise, as a promise of eternity. The art of forming and following a parable, therefore, lies in nothing less than in the ability to feel and see the parable character of one's own existence, and thereby to become in one's own existence a parable of God in relation to other people. This is the secret of the success of the parables. Like good poems, like resonant songs, they say and sing themselves as a poetry of eternity through the millennia. But precisely the unheard of tension and density of a parable in terms of this religious dimension can only be understood by psychological means. And so here, as you see, Drewermann counters the false dichotomy between theology and psychology. And he says that we cannot say theology cannot be understood psychologically without reducing it to psychology. Drewermann goes on, since there are and will always be reviewers and critics who raise the objection to a theological approach such as the present one, that here all of theology is being, quote, psychologized, unquote, let us take this opportunity one last time to explain as clearly as possible that it is precisely the other way around. That we are concerned solely with showing that depending on one's attitude toward God, not something, but everything changes in a human being. And that the psychology of a human being shapes itself in fundamentally different ways, depending on whether finiteness closes over one's life like a grave. and opens under oneself like a devouring maw. Or whether the hands of God embrace one with trust and shelter one's existence and lead one back to the place where heaven touches earth. Whoever refuses to see by what psychological means a space of understanding and freedom can be opened up in the form of parables, where God can be experienced, and how conversely, an attitude of deeper trust towards God, stimulated, for example, by a well-told parable, changes all feelings down to the root, can only want and practice a form of pastoral work and proclamation, which is ultimately heteronymous and terroristic, however much it may speak of grace, peace, and redemption. End of quote here from Drewermann. So if only Drewermann's critics had read this passage very carefully, this passage on page 729 to 730, they could never have lodged the criticisms against him that they then did, that he is reducing everything to psychology. Because here he says that actually it is the very relationship to God, the way we consciously also, the way our spirit, our self-reflective spirit relates to the question of the divine, that determines our whole psychology and not the other way around. That is really important. If Benedict XVI would read these 2 pages, he would have to revise all the criticisms that he has lodged against Drewermann, because he talks several times about Drewermann. For instance, in his book, Salt of the Earth, or in a famous speech he gave to the bishops of Latin America, and in a book on the interpretation on scripture. I have described some of that in my book, The English Introduction into Drewermann's work, A Violent God Image. You can read it there, in the introduction especially. So with this background on how to understand and interpret parable narratives that describe the human relationship to God in its existential and psychological depth, we now turn to Drewermann's interpretation of the well-known parable of the sower in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark. And so this is in the 2nd volume of Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark. This is it's the 1st volume. Yeah, sorry. It's in the 1st volume, chapter 4. I will read a translation of this parable that I have adapted from Drewermann's own translation of the parable in German. I have consulted the original Greek myself. I fortunately had the opportunity to study Greek in seminary and have kind of kept it up a little bit. And so, and then compared it with some English translations. So here is my translation based on Drewermann's, the Greek, and some English translations. The parable is in Mark 4, verses 1 to 20. And the first part is the parable, and then is an interpretation that obviously was added by later writers and put into Jesus' mouth. So here's the parable of the manifold seed. Again, he, meaning Jesus, began to teach by the sea, and a very large crowd gathered around him, so that he stepped into a boat and sat down on the sea, while the whole crowd remained close to the sea on land. And he taught them many things in parables, and said to them in his teaching, "Listen, look, a sower went out to sow. And while he sowed, the following happened. Some fell beside the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Others fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprung up, because it did not have much depth in the soil. But when the sun rose, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered. Others again fell into the thistles, and the thistles grew up and choked it, so that it yielded no fruit. Still others fell into good soil and yielded fruit, growing up, increasing and bearing, 1 30-fold, 1 60-fold, 1 100-fold. And he said, anyone who has ears to hear, hear. And when he was alone, excuse me. And when he was alone, those who were around him, together with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you, the mystery of God's kingdom has been given. From God, Drewermann adds here. But to those outside, everything happens in parables, so that, and this is a quote from Isaiah 6, 9 and 10 actually, so that seeing they might see and yet not perceive, hearing they might hear and yet not understand, that they never repent and be forgiven. And he says to them, you do not even understand this parable? How are you going to understand all the parables at all? The sower sows the word of God. The ones on the way are those where the word is sown, and as soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. The ones sown on rocky ground are those who, as soon as they hear the word, receive it with joy. Yet they have no root in themselves, but are only temporary beings. Then, when tribulation arises, or persecution because of the word, they immediately stumble. Others again are those sown among the thistles. Those are the ones who have indeed heard the word, but the worries of the world age, the deceit of riches, the desires for everything else enter the picture and choke the fruit, choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. But those sown on good soil are those who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit. 1 30-fold, 1 60-fold, 1 100-fold. And here's Drewermann's interpretation. Based on a depth psychological exegesis that is applying the principles that we heard in the first part of this lecture. The Sea of Galilee in the Jordan Rift Valley of Galilee forms an oval of about 12 by 20 kilometers. Its clear waters colored by the blue of the sky, and its waves painted by the white of the clouds. The Gospels prefer to have Jesus speak to us about the realm of God on the shores of this lake, because it is as if our own heart were to become a pure mirror capable of receiving the image of heaven. This is how intimately familiar Jesus wanted to make us with the figure and word of his Father, and how much he tried to calm the waves of our soul's restlessness. How does one reach a person in the midst of anxiety? That is the real problem of this wonderful parable of Jesus. It is a question not unlike that of how to keep a rabbit from falling that has lost its way in front of dogs on the edge of a rocky slope. Any careless movement, any falling couples will only increase its fear. A tiny twitch is enough, and it will plunge to its death. Nevertheless, if one wants to save the animal, one must by all means catch it in time and carry it against all its bristling back to the safe plain. Jesus tries something similar in this parable of the manifold seed. Perhaps he told the parable for the first time after springtime in Galilee, when the disciples felt glum and dejected as they recounted to him the results of their failures. How many had already turned their backs on them? How few were still willing to carry the message, and that everything seemed doomed to failure. Like all great poetry, Jesus' parables are always spoken beyond the situation of their occasion into all time. This parable of the manifold seed addresses any kind of discouragement, despair, resignation, and weariness. The worldview in every real depression looks as Jesus portrays it here. What is wonderful, however, is how fully Jesus allows the feeling of dejection to be expressed in this parable, so that it can be overcome precisely in its detailed portrayal. When we try to comfort each other, we usually or often do so by asking the other to pull themselves together, to not let their head hang down, and to approach their problem from the right angle. We appeal to their character, to their courage, their determination, and whether we intend it or not, all our exhortations and advice ultimately only put new pressure on them. That is, we make wrong moves at the edge of the steep slope. It is wonderful that in contrast to that, Jesus tries to give voice in his parables to the distress of the human heart by describing it with such empathy that even those who are affected by it often cannot express it better. Everything that Jesus says in his parable of the sower and his field fits precisely into this perspective of a person afflicted by dark discouragement, by hopelessness, and by final despair. He has worked hard and done everything possible. He has tried to do as well in life as he can. He has risked and invested everything he had. And now the anxiety begins. In the words of this parable, it is as if the sower were constantly lying in wait, with a trembling heart to protect his seed from harm. A flock of birds swoops down, and he cannot stop it. Inside, he feels agitated, frightened, and angry. He would prefer to exterminate the whole brood of birds, but they will return every hour and every day. People dare to go across his field. With broad boots, they tremble on this field, as if they had no eyes and could not know exactly what they were destroying. And they are unstoppable. This makes me think right now on the boots on the ground in the Ukraine. This is the historical situation in which I'm giving this lecture. Boots on the ground tremble everything that people felt worth living for. There's so much despair right now. And the question, of course, for what reason is so much harm done, so much destruction? If we think of the way Drewermann speaks of parables, parables as trying to help us open a window into eternity so that the desire to control just this world comes to an end. And he goes actually in the latter part of this parable interpretation somewhat into this actually. I'll continue with Drewermann's interpretation. The stones that lie in the field prevent the seed from growing. And one can have plowed the ground as much as one wants. There will continue to be stones everywhere. After all, one cannot remove the clot of earth all the way to the center of the world. The deeper one gets, the harder the rock becomes. And weeds exist. This living contradiction to everything sown as crops. The power of weeds to multiply and proliferate is so great. Now, Drewermann acknowledges that as he has just spoken this way, he acknowledges in a footnote. Let me read what he writes here. Read this way, particular images of the parable are basically allegorized existentially, which actually violates the rule of interpretation that says that a parable has only one point of comparison that anchors its meaning. However, it must be permissible in a sermon to describe particular image elements of a parable when presenting their emotional meaning, if and as long as the empathic description serves the purpose of clearly uncovering the emotionally decisive point, which in this case is the contrast between resignation and confidence. So if the existential allegorizing is in the service of the overarching point of the parable, of this main point of the story, then this can be permissible, he says. Going back to his interpretation in the main text, this is how one can view the world, God knows, with a constant gaze on everything that is lost, trampled on, and suffocated. And one ends up in despair if one sees the world this way. So now we get to the main gist of this parable. The experience of despair, of discouragement, and so on. One ends up in despair if one sees the world this way. But with agonizing patience, Jesus at first seems to almost completely justify this view of the world. That is how broadly and in great detail he describes it. It is as if he wanted to give each of his listeners first the feeling that they have a right to feel this way. For there are 100 reasons in their life experience which have taught them to see life in this way. And all these reasons deserve to be taken seriously. Therefore, their sadness must find words, and their resignation must be able to hope to receive understanding if one really wants to help them. Nevertheless, the incredible endurance of Jesus, the German word here is the long breath, in this parable of the sower is entirely carried by the wind of the breath of God's hope. Because this is what Jesus actually wants to say. You can look at the whole world again and again in that way. You can constantly pay attention to how much it costs to keep this world in existence. How much wasted effort, how much failure, how much tragedy there is in it. Eventually, if you only look deep enough into the abyss, you will once again see the hand that carries everything and created everything. Below the dark abyss, you will once again meet the hands of your Father. And here Drewermann, in a footnote, quotes Rainer Maria Rilke's famous poem, Autumn. The leaves are feeling, something that you can look up for yourself. How does Jesus get at this confidence? At bottom, the evidence of human experience breaks off at this point. Now, this is again already the point of that he's not psychologizing it away or is trying to just psychologize the story, as if we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. This sentence, at bottom, the existence of human experience breaks off at this point of despair. It is, of course, true that no farmer in Galilee or anywhere else in the world will sow without some certainty that it will be profitable. But what does this fact prove? Failure and tragedy do exist in human life. Jesus certainly does not deny this. And yet, he sees all of the futility of human effort embraced by the unconditional promise of God. At some point, one has to dare to jump over the abyss. Even if our own life seems so tiny to us, even if we already believe that certainly nothing will ever become of us, Jesus counters that it is perhaps the most important thing in life to think unwaveringly that God did not create us in the first place and entrusted us to the field of the earth if God were not planning something particular with us. Even if we feel as if it made hardly any sense that we exist in the world, and even if for many years we see virtually no reason for any future, and I want to put in parentheses here, as my patient that I talked about did, and so many patients I have worked with that are in despair or that are suffering from depression or anxiety or many other ailments, which would be the psychological way of experiencing this form of despair. So even if for many years we see virtually no reason for any future, we should trust God that we have not been entrusted to life without a purpose, without a plan, and without an inalienable dignity. We can trust that the hands of God, that the sower of eternity knew what she was doing when she delivered us into the stream of time. With God, our life has a reward, a yield, a justification, and a value, often 100 times more than we know. Jesus wanted that his message of the realm of heaven would make us think this way. We are seeds of immortality, seeds of heaven, destined to return to the stars with all the riches of this world. Some of you might think of the phrase, we are stardust. And Drewermann here, in a footnote, says the following: the widespread idea of the dignity and destiny of humans was most beautifully developed by the ancient Egyptians in their ideas of the afterlife, in which they regarded the human soul as a golden bird that in death wants to return to the stars, to its eternal home, And Drewermann then goes into also some ideas of astrophysicism. He quotes Hubert Reeves, somebody who has popularized cosmology and its meaning for us. But this is something that one can read in the footnotes then. I want to continue with the final parts here of Drewermann's interpretation. Now, the early church took up this gospel in its times of discouragement and persecution in its own way. It asked what kind of people we are as believers in the midst of the community of Jesus. Is not our soul itself like such a field, manifold in terms of the fate of the seed? And is the lot of the church itself, this field of God in human history, often not rather discouraging and lamentable as a result of the spiritual barrenness of its members? So very often, Drewermann says, historical critical exegesis has sort of stayed with the way the early church interpreted this parable and other parables in terms of the meaning that it made of the parables for its own existence. Now, Drewermann goes on, though, here to interpret this story and the different ways the seed falls and what happens to the seed, the fate of the seed, not in terms of the church's existence, but in terms of our own existence. What particular meanings this might have. So the first one that the parable means is that the birds steal the seeds. Drewermann writes, it is possible that people have heard the awakening words of their eternal calling, and yet we see that for many years they have been unable to understand what these words actually mean. Any thought of God has literally been stolen from their hearts. Everything they were taught to think and feel seems to refute the faith of Christians. Here, I want to interject that one can think of people that feel like that religious language really has harmed them, or people that have turned their backs to religion, have become atheists or agnostics, partly because the very word of God has been used to steal from their hearts. But with it also, the belief in a deeper meaning of themselves might have been stolen. So Drewermann continues, for example, one tries to explain to them that they carry in their transient body an immortal soul, but they are not accustomed to look at their lives in this way. Rather, they were taught that they're simply a function of the laws of nature, that they are but a tiny sample of the eternal struggle for existence. Therefore, their whole concern should be to live a healthy life for at least a few decades. More could neither be meant nor intended by human existence. If one speaks to such people of God, it arouses in them almost wistful laughter. The idea of God is to them identical with childish illusions and shallow foolishness. Even if one points out to them that they condemn themselves with such an attitude in life to a world without dignity, to an existence without beauty, without poetry, without transfiguration, they will reply that nothing more can be hoped for, nothing more can be expected from life. One is born and one dies. One comes into the world and one decays. What else is there to say? The question is only how to live reasonably happy in the meantime. All other considerations seem useless and superfluous. Now, this is probably the way most people think today. Wherever one looks, we can hear people talk like this, see them live like this, without any reflection, every hour, every day, diligent and strained to the point of stupefaction. against this emptiness of spirit, against this picking away of every thought of God, one cannot find any words. Even the church of Jesus, which had these wonderful parables of Jesus ringing in their ears, did not know how to reply to people who are like that. And yet, contrary to this interpretation of the early church that we find in the latter portion of that parable in the Gospel of Mark, so contrary to this interpretation of the early church, should we not hope that Jesus uttered words that could transform even such a worldview? We are more than dust of the earth. In each of us breathes the breath of life of God. The face of each person touches heaven, and their life's path also leads into the gate of infinity. Yet how much love, understanding, and kindness do people need in order to sense the dreams of eternity in their hearts again? And for clarification, Drewermann says in a footnote here, he quotes a G. Sigmund, Psychology of Faith in God, based on literary examples. And this is my translation. I have not yet looked whether there's an English translation of this book. The fundamental question today, however, he actually says to a quote that he had from this writer, the fundamental question today, however, is no longer directly about how a person comes to believe in the absolute personhood of God. The fundamental question is rather how a person is able to find her or himself again as a person. And then he quotes Max Horkheimer, a book, again, I have to check the English title here, that if it's directly translated, The Longing for the Completely Different. Max Horkheimer developed from the elements of the present his vision of a threatening future of subject destruction, where individuality and freedom would be replaced by the collective obedience of all. Such a society, Horkheimer thought, could regard theology and philosophy only as a ludicrous pastime. I go back to the main text here. We're still talking about the interpretation of what the bird stealing the seed could mean. So, how much love, understanding, and kindness do people need in order to sense the great dreams of eternity in their hearts again? That is the real problem. How does one awaken the children of cities, those conceived during nights illuminated by lampions, to the sight of the stars? How does one awaken ears destroyed by the booming of discos to perceive the music of heaven? How does one stretch those already suffocated in the dungeon of the earth to long for infinity? Almost contrary to Jesus' original parable, the early church already knew only how to answer all of these questions with the language of threat, instead of the language of Jesus' confidence. And here, Drewermann quotes Oscar Pfister, the Swiss psychoanalyst and pastor who was a longtime friend of Sigmund Freud's. And let me see, I believe I have this book that Drewermann is quoting from here with me. Yes, I have the German version here, Oskar Pfister. This is Christianity and Fear, or das Christentum und die Angst. And so, so he quotes Pfister here, who demanded correctly that the Christian doctrine of faith must focus on the hygiene of anxiety, so that one has to really look for how does anxiety distort everything and destroy everything, instead of getting lost in compulsive neurotic fashion in the dogma as a miserable surrogate of life and love, and to wreck the brains and bodies of people for irrational theories who, according to the example of Jesus, only want to love God warmly in their neighbor. Here's a quote, and this is my translation. I'll have to look. I think this book was translated into English. The Christian doctrine of faith, wrote Pfister, must in its content and dynamic statements be the doctrine of love, or it is not Christian doctrine of faith. And he added, I can't understand how anyone would want to do scholarly work on the scripture, church history, and so on, without having thoroughly studied the psychology of anxiety and compulsion. This really inspired Drewermann. Another quote, even the historically critically elaborated Christ attains anxiety relieving power only insofar as he is loved. In the process, the Christ as model, the Christ before me, becomes the Christ in me. The Christ whom I love, the Christ who first loved me. Moving on to the second way in which the seeds do not really bear the fruit that they could bear, which is on rocky ground, falling on rocky ground. Drewermann writes, others understand the word and receive it enthusiastically, but strangely enough, cannot follow it for fear of death, for fear of themselves. Again and again, they have been taught to distrust every deeper feeling, and to stop every. I'll read the sentence again. Again and again, they have been taught to distrust every deeper feeling, and to stop every passionate stirring of the heart, as if it were something dangerous, with the result that their life feels like they live in a centrifuge, rotating ever more rapidly around itself, thrown ever further out to the periphery, emptied more and more of any content. How can we seize again the opportunity to grow into depth, to learn to be in silence, and to not only listen to words so that we immediately carry them outside, but to let them unfold within ourselves? One very simple law of life says that all truth that exists and wants to grow needs time and must be given time. And let it be unfold in our own lives. our own life deserves the trust that everything that is held in it has a right to mature. We do not have to live like people who, in a sense, live only in the second or third floors of our houses, for fear that monsters and dragons live in the basement of their homes. You may realize that many movies today actually play on those fears, but don't really solve those fears. I continue with Drewermann. We may believe that even and especially in the undercurrent of our unconscious feelings, longings, and desires, the pure energy of heaven flows through our soul, and that nothing that lives in us must be excluded from its unfolding. If we let it grow, it becomes part of God's eternity. And then moving on to the thorns and thistles that prevent the fruit from growing, Drewermann writes, a third group of people will say, we really understand what Jesus wanted when he spoke of the realm of God. There's something magical about his message of carelessness, of open-heartedness, of goodness, of patience and harmony with the power of the Creator. But we cannot live like that. Circumstances prevent us from doing so. All the duties, all the tasks, all the requirements of everyday life, all this wear and tear and the rushing from morning to night, it is impossible to stand up against all that. The realm of God is not on the schedule we're permitted. Open-heartedness is not part of the program of our employer. At any rate, humanity is not an inventory item in office rooms and law firms. So, what can we do? The fight against the thorns is essentially about us noticing once and for all how much at every point we ourselves create the seeming omnipotence of circumstances due to anxiety. It is our anxiety that makes us believe that others would have a right to interrupt our lives with what they say. And so just to prevent misunderstanding here, this is not to disregard that there can be real circumstances that can have an impact on us. But just as we know in trauma research, a lot of how one experiences a trauma has to do with how other people related to one, and a lot depends on other things that were going on in one's life, which then decide what meanings we give to the trauma. The American psychoanalyst Joyce McDougall has written on trauma and how trauma also becomes the locus of other developmental processes that are going on, giving certain meanings to this external trauma or circumstance that had actually nothing directly with that circumstance or trauma. So that's kind of what Drewermann is talking about here. We have some say in what power the circumstances have over us, whether we think we're completely reduced to them or not. And that is often the only power we have in circumstances, that are very adverse. So Drewermann continues, in the face of criticism by others, it is time and again our anxiety that prevents us to relativize once and for all things that do not deserve to be taken so seriously. It is our anxiety that keeps us down on the ground in the face of the imagined power and greatness of others, and that does not allow us to blossom into the beauty and greatness that is ours. This, in many respects, was the experience of the patient I mentioned earlier. In truth, there are ultimately no objective constraints, meaning in our mind. But there is an anxiety with us that needs and creates all sorts of constraints. I want to also explain that because often we are so afraid that something bad can happen outside that we feel almost more secure in our constrained way of life. Or someone who has felt imprisoned for a long time inside feels if they risk now to be different, how will they be seen? For instance, a patient who is suffering from being bullied for her size, for being overweight, may feel a lot when people say, oh, you have lost weight. They may feel that that itself is something where they feel more shame around. And so they may feel that they rather stay in the place where they're now, that they actually don't want to stay, that creates health problems for them. But the fear of putting themselves out there, risking themselves as a new person could be used again against them. And so that can be a block for them because it's hard to kind of get out of this vicious cycle. And so this is kind of what I think Drewermann is talking about here. So there's anxiety within us that needs and creates all sorts of constraints. Now we come to a point that I also already referenced a little bit. The anxiety of existence tries to tie itself most intensely to the greed for wealth, as if money could protect us and bestow us in the end everything we have missed for so long: influence, power, and prestige. In contrast to the thistles and the thorns of life. In the spirit of Jesus' parable of the manifold seed, one would like to call out to everyone and oneself in hundreds of different ways. Have courage to follow the beauty of your own mature self. Fear neither the depth of your soul nor the constrictions of your environment. Above all, however, do not surrender to the flow of time. You are a child of the Almighty Father. And even though there are hours when you hardly dare to believe, trust that God knew what God was doing when God created you. A miraculous work in God's own hands. And finally, it makes no sense to calculate what our life is worth. 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold. What is the point? That we exist counts in itself infinitely much more before God. For out of nothing, God called us through time into God's eternity. Here ends the interpretation Drewermann has of the parable of the sower. Next week, we will engage Drewermann's interpretation of the so-called healing of the woman with the issue of blood, as it's often called, or the bleeding woman, and the daughter of Jairus. This is a fascinating story that has the story of a basically teenage girl and a woman mixed up in each other. And there is a lot of significance in the way the story was transmitted to us, where these two stories are two sides of one story, Drewermann will argue. Now, we will move our lectures to Saturdays, which will give me more time for the translation of the text. It's also, Drewermann had been doing his own lecture series on Christianity and the justice system, which he concluded for the semester in Germany. Those were streamed, or those were available on YouTube on Saturday mornings. And so the plan is that on Saturdays, this lecture series will continue. We have several more lectures after this. And I want to thank you for attending today, for listening today. I hope that it was meaningful. Whether you are somebody who is preaching or is in pastoral care, or you're just trying to understand the Bible and the stories of parables better, or the stories of the Gospel of Mark, of course, and how they can relate to your own life. I hope that this way of interpreting is helpful and resonates with you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye for now, and have a great week.